Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. I'm very excited to have our guest joining us today. I had a chance to have him on the radio a couple of weeks ago, and I knew I wanted to have a much more in-depth conversation with him. His name is Phillip Magness. I'm going to have to read this. I apologize, Phillip, because it's a mouthful. Senior Research Faculty and Director of Research and Education at the American Institute for Economic Research. You have a PhD in economics. You've got a master's in public policy, which is just fantastic because we're going to talk about all kinds of things today. But let's start off here. Tell us a little bit about AIER.
Yeah, so AIER is one of the oldest free market research institutes in the United States. We were founded in 1933 at the peak of the Great Depression to basically advocate for free markets, sound money, all of the things that were going up against what the New Deal agenda sought to achieve during the 1930s. And basically since then until the present, we've been a consistent voice in making the positive case for a free society and a free market economy that's built upon.
Do you think it's interesting? I've had a couple of conversations in the last few weeks with David Stockman, who is Reagan's OMB director. In fact, we interviewed him for this podcast. And one of the things I talked about was the persistence of New Deal programs. We talked about the attempts in the Reagan administration to kill things like the Interstate Commerce Commission. But do you think, was this the goal? Was the goal of the New Deal to create these programs that were going to persist 60, 70, 80, 100 years into the future?
Yeah, so I think there is some bureaucratic lag that's been built into the programs. I really see the greater goal of the New Deal is to vastly expand the range of federal power, of the ability of the federal government to step on in as an economic manager, as someone who can centrally plan aspects of economic life. And almost all of the New Deal programs were built around that. Now, they nominally said, this is a depression relief measure for the Great Depression, but it was a crisis moment that allowed them to vastly expand.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt there, but that's exactly it. I mean, this was the real precursor to Rahm Emanuel saying, never let a crisis go to waste. I'm reminded of one of my favorite Supreme Court cases, and yes, I'm a guy who has a favorite Supreme Court case, is the 1992 New York versus United States case, in which Justice O'Connor said the Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that you might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one branch as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day. Now, she wrote that in 1992, which is sort of an era in which we were seeing the first steps towards pulling back from those New Deal programs. But let me ask you this, as someone who has both a PhD and an MPP, crisis-driven policy is almost always bad policy, is it not?
That is exactly the case. Economists refer to this as a concept known as the ratchet effect, that whenever a crisis comes along, there's a hasty emergency response to whatever is unfolding, and then the program that's created becomes entrenched. It attracts interest groups around it that hold it into place, and it just becomes the next basis for another time that a crisis comes along, that they jump in and further solidify what was gained in the last crisis. So the classic example is the Woodrow Wilson administration used the crisis of World War I to vastly expand the federal government's role in the economy, but they couldn't make it on a permanent basis. So there was some backtrack in the 1920s. New Deal comes along, Great Depression comes along. They basically used that to deliver everything that was attempted a generation earlier.
That's astounding to me. Well, it's like Grover Norquist, who we're going to have at some point. It talks about the Spanish-American War telephone tax. That's still with us
for like a century, basically.
Yeah, it really is amazing there. So let's talk about some of these other issues. You guys at AIER and you specifically are involved in a whole host of things. Really, this great intersection of, again, economics and public policy and the decision-making process that's gone out. You guys were particularly vocal. You were particularly vocal about, again, crisis-driven policy, COVID, and what we were doing with COVID. Talk a little bit about the work that you were doing there.
This is a classic example of the ratchet effect in place. because most of the policies that were made during COVID, these decisions to announce that we were going into lockdown and all these measures that we dealt with basically for 2 straight years were almost invariably enacted under emergency powers that had been passed in earlier crises. A lot of it was the post 9/11 emergency response. They used bioterrorism provisions to enact broader public health measures, but some of it even went back to the Cold War or World War II as emergency powers that were claimed. What AIER did during the pandemic was to offer a reasoned scientific voice against this new claiming of powers, the exercise of lockdowns, all of the mandates that were enacted outside of normal democratic constitutional means, just by providing some scientific pushback. The major thing that we undertook midway through the pandemic was known as the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yes.
And this was a gathering of, we had 3 scientists from top universities that had been critics and skeptics of the lockdown measure. They actually were really just restating what the scientific consensus was prior to 2020. If you go back to the WHO's pandemic response plans in 2019, they say very clearly lockdowns do not work. These are a bad idea. They have too many damaging effects, and there's no evidence that they even deliver on what they promised to do. So we brought these scientists together, and they held a conference that was basically just reiterating the best scientific evidence we had prior to COVID on lockdowns and making this case in a way that went up against Fauci and some of the figures in the NIH and the administration. And the result of the conference, they issued a clear 1-page public statement of principles, making the case against lockdowns, making an argument of other measures we should try. The main one was focus protection, and this is where you take special measures to isolate nursing homes, elderly people, vulnerable communities. But meanwhile, everyone else, they basically get back to living their normal lives to blunt some of the harms that were coming from the lockdowns themselves. So this document was released, it went viral, and then it became target number 1, basically, for Anthony Fauci.
Let's talk about that, because the other things you've been writing about and others have been writing about is the issue of the Twitter files and the suppression of information. I mean, I want to get into the Fauci's lies, but this is a perfect segue into what happened with Twitter, because the Great Barrington Declaration, like so many other things, right? I was raised, you were raised, I don't know, Phil, because we haven't talked about this. So my father is a scientist, a PhD mineralogist, but someone who dealt with public health issues throughout his career. And my dad raised me to be a skeptic, to sort of look at things and say, you know something, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. To think about unintended consequences, which is something we haven't gotten into much. But, you know, his area of expertise was asbestos and asbestos-related policy. And you know, that sort of drove me to think more empirically about things. But you have to have the debate, right? You have to apply things to a vigorous discussion. But there was a thumb on the scale in all of this. Talk about that.
Absolutely. So the purpose that we organized the Great Barrington Declaration Conference for was to bring that debate before the public. We realized in October 2020 that the case against lockdowns had never even really entered into the equation when they were rolled out. So we brought scientific voices, people that are experts in this exact subject, to weigh in and make the case against lockdowns. And we expected a vigorous debate to follow. And initially, I'd say in the first 2 or 3 days after the declaration came out, the media took interest. The petition itself went viral. The doctors were all over television and in print media, just offering for the first time that many people had even heard this argument that lockdowns do not work. But then about 3 days later, we noticed a very sharp turn in the public dialogue around it. We started getting attacked, both online and in the media. The Great Barrington Declaration started getting smeared with ad hominem attacks, not so much a rebuttal of its scientific arguments, but claims that it was funded by dark money or that there were all these conspiracies behind trying to reopen the economy to make profit. Just complete nonsensical things. And it really kind of came to a head within 3 or 4 days after the declaration coming out, that the tone shifted. And then the next thing we start noticing is that the Great Barrington Declaration's rankings in Google News coverage starts to drop. And mainstream sources such as the Wall Street Journal and Fox News are now popping up on page 3 and 4 in their articles about the Great Barrington Declaration. And the number one hit is like this fringe conspiracy blog out of the United Kingdom that claimed that the evil Koch brothers had funded the Declaration in order to make profits on killing.
Sorry, Philip. You know, I wanted you to continue with the story, but you know, at some point, right, that the invocation, the incantation of the Koch brothers, and then Charles and David would magically appear. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pure conspiracy theorizing that rose to the top of the media coverage, and this is appearing all over Google. It's appearing in some of the news stories that we're seeing coming out. So it did kind of catch us off guard because we were expecting an honest, forthright, scientific debate. Even if we disagreed with Fauci,
Right.
we wanted Fauci to have that discussion with us. What really happened, though, and we discovered this a year later, so I led a team here at AIER. We filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the NIH just to see what had happened in those couple of weeks after the Great Barrington Declaration. We got the files delivered to us. It was basically right around Christmas Eve of 2021, so they wait for a convenient time when no one's paying attention to do the document drop. And I'm reading through the FOIA returns that they give us. First off, they redact quite a bit, so we don't know the full story. But I find this smoking gun of an email, and it's from Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, to Anthony Fauci and several of his top lieutenants, basically the inner circle at the very top of the bureaucracy. And what Collins says is he expresses concern about the Great Barrington Declaration being issued and says he basically orders Fauci to wage a, quote, devastating published takedown. Against the, quote, fringe epidemiologists, not engage them on scientific evidence, but basically wage a smear campaign.
I gotta say real quick, because I want to jump back into the story. You know, in terms of public health officials, I don't know Fauci from Adam, but I followed Francis Collins' career for a long time, especially because he's someone who, you know, had been someone who would was vociferous in his expressions of faith and faith as regards to science. Nobody in this community have I been more disappointed in than Francis Collins. But so the smoking gun, he goes to Fauci. It says wage war against this, not on the scientific merits, but we cannot have dissent, right? Where does it go from there?
Well, Fauci immediately kicks into gear. Within like 10 minutes of receiving this email, he sends out his first response, which is not a scientific response. He copies and pastes this crazy op-ed out of Wired magazine that, ironically, this is October 2020, and the op-ed is basically saying the Great Barrington Declaration is wrong because we've already been through lockdowns. They're a thing of the past. They're arguing against an old policy from last spring. We're turning the corner, and this is just an assault on public health. So he sends this political op-ed by a non-expert around to the NIH staff as his main talking point to answer the Great Barrington Declaration. And not only that, it turns out to be a political op-ed that's debunked within 3 weeks as the world goes back into lockdowns round 2.
Time out for a second. And let's, because we can't now, I know you guys, I don't know if you're a 501c3, 501c4 organization, not that anybody needs to know, but you're not a political organization. You're not engaged in electoral politics. What you have to remember, the context is everything. And I talk about this quite a bit on the radio. Timing and context and timelines cannot be ignored. The fact that all of this stuff is taking place around the time that we're involved in this election, an election which was fundamentally changed because of the lockdowns and lockdown policy, all of this stuff, right? I mean, listen, you know, as we're recording this, you know, we're understanding the document story with Joe Biden, not that we need to go down this road, all happening around the midterm elections. So timing is everything. So 3 weeks go by and this thing gets debunked. But at that point, you're already in, as you said, lockdown round 2. Please let us rejoin the story there.
Yeah. So over the next week, it just continues. It's one hit after another coming from these email chains between Collins and Fauci. So they start circulating other political op-eds from The Nation magazine. There's one point where Collins sends a private email to Fauci and says, yeah, I just trashed the Great Barrington Declaration in the Washington Post. So I'm paraphrasing here. And Fauci responds and says, oh, good, I agree with that. And then they have this kind of a snickering moment. It says, well, I think the Trump administration is too busy with other things, obviously referring to the election
Yeah.
to care, because otherwise they'd be mad at us for basically going out and making this political statement on behalf of the administration.
So let me ask you this. Phil, did you notice as you got these documents, as you said, in December of 2020, so after the election, but before the new administration comes in.
So it's actually December 2021, so it's a whole year later.
Got it. My apologies. Yeah. So a year ago, something, I am having a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that we are going to come up on the third anniversary of all of this.
That's
again, it's like the movie Groundhog Day. But my point is this: did you notice in the correspondence around NIH a political angle, a political agenda? Were there a lot of references, or how many references were there to Donald Trump in all of this?
Right. So it's a 100% political angle.
Yeah.
I saw very little evidence of anything scientific. It was all strategizing behind the scenes to control the NIH's message, because what Fauci and Collins were aware of is that there was dissent within the Trump administration, in particular. So Trump had another member of the COVID task force. You may remember Scott Atlas.
Sure.
And Atlas was much more sympathetic to the Great Barrington Declaration style response of arguing against lockdowns, of going in a more focused protection route, and had kind of been an advocate of that in front of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who's supposed to be the boss.
Yeah.
But what Fauci and Collins are doing is they're kind of conspiring privately to make sure that Atlas's message is suppressed. So one of the emails we discovered is a chain going back and forth between Fauci, Collins, and Deborah Birx, and it's all about them worrying that Atlas is going to bring up the Great Barrington Declaration at next week's COVID task force meeting. So it's a heavily redacted email, but the part that they did release, so the part that's not blacked out, indicates all these signs that Collins and Fauci and Birx are preparing their talking points, their messages, to shut down even any discussion of the Great Barrington Declaration from taking place on the COVID task force if Atlas, their adversary within the administration, tries to bring it up. And they go back and forth on this, and we find one of the aftermath emails. They're all celebrating that that the Great Barrington Declaration is not entered into the discussion, and they basically announce that this is a victory for their side of the political debate internally.
I mean, it is amazing to me because there's not supposed to be sides, or there's not supposed to be declarations of victory. This is all about, the whole goal is to protect the American people, and it's to protect the American people from the proximate threat, and then to protect the American people from, any ancillary threats, and then to protect the American people from any unintended consequences, intended or otherwise, in terms of addressing that threat. Let's fast forward a little bit to the deposition of Fauci and sort of uncovering the lies that were told. Talk about that, and talk about the context of it. Like, why was there a deposition, and then what was said?
Yeah, so I released the findings of this FOIA request in December 2021, and it starts a media fire fest. By this point of the pandemic, even mainstream media sources are starting to tire of Fauci to some degree. So after we release the emails, for example, the Wall Street Journal runs a full editorial basically calling for an investigation into this clearly political, unscientific behavior by the man that's calling himself the science. And in the next few weeks, we had those hearings in Congress. And in particular, there's a Senate hearing where Fauci came before one of the committees, and Rand Paul grills him over these emails and says, basically, what did you know? What do you mean by a takedown campaign? And Fauci's his usual evasive self, trying to deny any involvement in it, trying to weasel his way around the political implications of the fact that he's now being scrutinized on this. And what happens over the next several months is this is kind of like the first plug being removed from the dam.
Yeah.
It's the discovery of this one email had several signs that there were other things going on as part of this takedown campaign, and so there's some other lawsuits that are being filed, and one of them discovers that there are White House advisors after the Biden administration takes over that are in communication with executives at Facebook and Twitter and all these social media companies. There are more revelations that we start to see that maybe people at the White House were putting pressure on the social media companies to suspend dissenting accounts. We also had some clues that in the aftermath of the Great Barrington Declaration, so the three authors of it, Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, and Sunetra Gupta at Oxford, two of the three of them were very active on Twitter, and they started seeing weird things happening with their accounts where it looked like they were being shadow banned. Or in Kulldorff's case, there was even a moment when he made a scientifically accurate but dissenting statement where they flagged it as misinformation.
Right.
So all of these things are happening.
Time out for a second. Yeah. This is the thing that gets me, right? Because so I work with in another endeavor with the editor of Real Clear Policy, who's also the editor of Real Clear Health, and someone who reads medical information on a daily basis. We did a podcast a long time ago talking about COVID and being critical of COVID. Again, he's a thoughtful guy.
Yeah.
And this is it gets me into you and I don't need to talk about this law in California, right? There's a medical information law that's going into place in California. And where someone who might very well be a recognized expert, right, legitimate, someone who's got an MD, PhD, and as an epidemiologist and a virologist and whatever, might have a dissenting view, but some bureaucrat in Sacramento is going to say that what they're saying is misinformation. This is amazing to me that someone could be a legitimate expert and have some faceless bureaucrat at a social media company label their stuff. And my point in raising my own stuff is that we had videos taken down because,
absolutely,
even though certainly I think my colleague knows more about the issues. This is what we're seeing. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, and there are multiple instances of exactly that happening. So Martin Kulldorff was, even before the pandemic, he had been on one of the main advisory committees at the CDC for vaccine safety, had invented some of the statistical techniques that they use and implement when they're tracking these things. And he was basically shoved off of the panel. As what we think is probably a retaliatory move. There was another instance, Governor DeSantis in Florida held a public hearing in the Capitol building of the state of Florida where he brought Jay Bhattacharya and several Great Barrington Declaration aligned medical experts to give testimony. And YouTube suspended the video. This isn't like a political campaign thing. This is a public hearing, a public record, and YouTube pulled it down because they claim that these experts are spreading misinformation about lockdowns and masks. So it's over and over again that we see this type of censorship being done in non-transparent ways by social media companies. And these social media companies, they don't have doctors on staff. This is a 26-year-old with a poetry degree. Who's self-appointed to be a fact checker on behalf of the social media company. So something really odd is going on here, and it's just this recurring pattern. Fast forward a year later, we've got actually the Attorney General of Missouri and the Attorney General of Louisiana come together, and they file a lawsuit to try to put together the pieces of all these hints of censorship that's coming out. And that's where the next explosive thing comes in, because in the discovery process, they find out not only is the government putting its thumb on the scale, but it's revelation after revelation to the point that what we had just over a month ago, Anthony Fauci was ordered by a federal judge to give testimony on what he did during this whole era.
Listen, I want to jump well ahead, right? And I want to talk about some of your writing. Because what I love about this, and I have a degree in Soviet studies, so I spend a lot of time, comparative politics, comparative economics. You write a lot about Marx.
Yes.
And this has all of the hallmarks of the Marxist, we could talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever, but the whole idea of totalitarian control of the media in terms of messaging. Do you see an interplay here, again, given your expertise on the issue of Marxism and Marxism in practice as opposed to Marxism in theory? Talk about that.
Yeah, so I think what we have here is a very clear case of the wokeification of employees at media companies, social media companies, big tech. Many of these big tech firms started as disruptors.
Yeah.
They were shoestring operations by someone who had an innovative idea at the right moment in history, and next thing you know, it exploded into Facebook or Twitter or Google or PayPal or any of these major firms in Silicon Valley that really did change the world in the way that commerce was done online and the way that we communicate with each other. And as those companies grew over the past decade or two, they start to expand and they start hiring people that move away from the original service that's provided, which is a platform as a means of communication, and they start moving into political change and social change. Next thing you know, that they have an internal department that is managing diversity initiatives in the platform, or an internal department that's managing misinformation. And a lot of these are people that are hired out of the university system that really don't have any degrees or training or expertise in tech issues, but they have a lot of political opinions, and they have majors and degrees that they've gotten in political activism, which comes from a very, very far left-wing portion of our university system. So to the point that they are not advocating a Marxist revolution or anything, but they have absorbed years and years of classroom instruction that basically frames the world in a Marxian sense of the haves versus the have-nots, and they believe their purpose in the job is to be an advocate for the underprivileged, the dispossessed, the persons that are victims, and that often aligns entirely with activism on behalf of far-left causes. So when you get censorship pressure from the government meeting woke employees, it's very clear where those woke employees are going to side, and soon enough, they rise to the top of the companies, the organizations. This is what we see in the Twitter files that are being released. There were instances where even the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, did not know some of these censorship measures are being taken. And it's all executives and junior executives feeding up to senior executives underneath him that have decided on a political course because they view their job as to control the information flow in advance of, say, an election that's on the horizon. So the 2020 election, or they were prepping probably for the 2022 election until that got disrupted.
You know, we may have put the chicken before the egg here. Because, you know, what I love about your work, Phil, is that it all ties together. You know, there's some folks who do stuff that's disjointed, myself included. But your work all ties together because what you were just talking about, and talking about, you know, the issue of Marx and Marxian thought, it then gets into your book, Cracks in the Ivory Tower.
Right.
And so talk a little bit more in depth about that, because that's what you're talking about when you talk about Cracks in the Ivory Tower, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big part of it. So Cracks in the Ivory Tower, it's an economic analysis of why our university systems, I think pretty obviously when you look at them, that they are full of problems. Yeah. And this is everything from just bureaucratic dysfunction. Even if you take the politics out of it, most universities are operated like the DMV. They're just monstrous bureaucracies that are full of waste, tuition's going up, the value of the degree never lives up to what is promised when they're recruiting students. Debt is placed on the backs of students. So there are all sorts of moral and ethical problems that come from the way we run our university system. You throw on top of that the politicization of the university, and I've got clear data of this going back to the 1960s. You can see the distribution of political ideology across the professoriate because they ask them in surveys. And if you go back to the 60s and 70s, it leans to the left of center, but it's only a plurality. It's like 40 to 45% of the professoriate says that we identify in the political left, and the remainder, that 60-ish% or so, is split about evenly between moderates and centrists, and then there's a conservative group. And then over the next couple of decades, you start to see first the conservatives begin to decline. But even as late as like 1995, 1997, 98, thereabouts, there's still a fairly even split. It's about 45% on the left, and then the remainder is split between everyone else. What happens after the late 1990s is the left begins to skyrocket. They grow from 45% to 60 to 65%.
Sure.
So 2/3 of the full university system. And as the left grows, that means there's an absolute decline in both conservative and moderate centrist professors. And a lot of this growth is taking place not in the hard sciences, not in the engineering department or the financial departments, business schools, accounting. It's almost all in the humanities and social sciences.
Yeah.
Which also happen to be the areas of the university that are losing majors. These are fields that are in decline. Because they don't have too much. There's not much of a job market for poetry majors,
Sure.
unless you work them into Facebook and Twitter as the new misinformation czar.
Yeah.
Which is where we see a lot of these employees going. But basically what we've seen in the last 20 years is the university system as a whole has shifted to the far left to the point that we can openly ask the question, are they even serving the public-facing purpose that we fund our universities with tax dollars to achieve? Universities are sold to the public on the basis that we want to educate our future, we want to drive innovation, we want a trained and well-rounded and well-educated population because that makes for a better society. It yields returns in innovation and discovery. It makes our future generation better equipped to compete in the world. So that's why we fund universities. But if it turns out that they're not doing any of those things, instead they're just basically subsidizing professors to be far left-wing activists and to train other people to be far left-wing activists, I'd openly ask the question, why do we keep writing checks out of the public treasury to sustain an English department that's just trying to train Marxist activists?
It's interesting you say that because we have this debate over whether or not the absence of faith is a faith. I think we can certainly go down the road and talk about how progressive ideology has now become a faith in and of itself. And so if we want to have government funds that don't go to faith-based institutions, we could have that debate over the role there. But if state universities are now becoming progressive faith-based institutions, maybe they should no longer receive. I think it's a really interesting idea because it gets into another book of yours that we have to talk about, which is the 1619 Project critique that you did.
Right.
And how this is it's not the end result, but it is certainly one of the results of a higher education system that has moved significantly further to the left ideologically. So now what was heretofore fact and factual analysis is now merely propaganda. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the 1619 Project, I know your listeners have probably encountered it over the last couple of years. It was this New York Times initiative to reimagine and reinvestigate American history through the lens of placing slavery as the centerpiece. And I'm not entirely opposed to that. I've done a lot of work on the economic history of slavery. I think there are valuable lessons to study and learn there. But what we discovered after the 1619 Project was released over the next several months, is the way the New York Times packaged and presented it and responded to its critics, is it was very clearly a work of editorial journalism, not scholarly history. And the first signs of this, so I critiqued elements of the 1619 Project immediately after it was published because the economics of it were factually wrong, factually inaccurate. But it started to take some flack from professional historians across the entire political spectrum. I found myself, as someone who comes kind of from a free market perspective, joining teams with the World Socialist website, which was also critiquing factual errors. But they were doing so on a scholarly basis. They brought in well-known left-of-center historians of the American Revolution that are pointing out the same thing that I am, that there are factual flaws. And what emerges over the next several years is the New York Times not only doubles down on those errors, it goes on the attack against left-of-center professors, let alone someone like myself, to try and smear and discredit us. And the basis of it is that not that we were wrong in critiquing the 1619 Project, not that our evidence was flawed. In fact, we had the stronger case, and there are unambiguous errors in the way that it presents the American Revolution. The grievance was that we had been heretics against a left-wing progressive narrative that is supposed to build up the case for things like slavery reparations and massive redistribution, that we had been heretics against a historical narrative that was aiming toward building a case for progressive policy results in the 2020 election or the 2022 election, as we now see. And you found a wing of this deeply politicized history profession that was incensed at the fact that we were even questioning the 1619 Project itself, because doing so would give evidence and cover to the bad guys being the political right, the people they deem reactionaries. So no matter how truthful and factually accurate our critiques were, they should be suppressed or politely shoved aside or impolitely silenced. Because doing so could undermine the larger political objective of having the 1619 Project in place.
Do you get a sense, and again, tying all of this together, right? Tying together your work on Marx and tying together your work in criticizing academia, there is a sense that Orwell's prediction about the reinvention of language so that you cannot have the language of dissent.
Exactly.
I mean, is this becoming manifest?
We are seeing it playing out in real time. We already know that in COVID. We saw multiple examples of Anthony Fauci speaking out of both sides of his mouth or changing terminology, contradicting himself, and no one would call him to account. I mean, if there was one figure in the entire pandemic who engaged in more misinformation peddling before the general public, it's Anthony Fauci. And I don't know of a single instance where he's ever been fact-checked. We move over to something like the 1619 Project. The most Orwellian thing that emerged on that was a discovery I made about a year after it came out. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the main editor organizer of it, had taken a lot of flack because the original version that came out in 2019 had this blurb on the website where it announced that the purpose of the 1619 Project was to basically replace the year 1776 with the year 1619 as America's, quote, true founding.
That's right. Yes.
So hugely controversial claim. If she wants to make that argument, she should understand that this is something that historians are going to look at and push back against, and they did. They took that particular line was probably one of the most heavily contested lines in the entire project. So a year later, she's taking continued flack, and she goes on CNN, and someone asked her about that line. And she says, with a straight face to the interviewer on CNN, I never claimed we were trying to make 1619 the true founding. And I'm just aghast watching this because I had seen her make that exact claim multiple times. She tweeted it out all over the place. Of course, she deletes her tweet history, so there's no record of it. And then I'm sitting here thinking, wait a minute, that was in the original version on the New York Times website. So I go and open up the old article from 2019, and suddenly the line's no longer there.
Yes.
So I found an old archived copy of it that had been cached on the internet and pulled it up and side by side. And it turns out that sometime in those intervening months, the New York Times had quietly ghost edited this controversial line out, just made it disappear, sent it down the Orwellian memory hole.
That's right. That's right. And you're left, right, it's the fundamental issue of gaslighting, because you're left thinking, well, wait a minute, did I not read this? Where did I read? Exactly. Could have sworn I read this. Right, he goes down with the whole with the tweets issue as well. I mean, it really is, and it's amazing to me because I think it's Hulu is about to do a miniseries. One of the streaming services is about to do a miniseries on the 1619 Project, and I'm aghast at this. Listen, I want to shift to some more not necessarily fun things. Actually, before we get to the fun things, let's talk about the work on. Let's talk about the state of the American economy right now. We just got some economics news that inflation may be slowing down a little bit, but in terms of economic freedom, we're at the lowest level since the Carter years, right?
Exactly. And a lot of this took place during COVID. There are actually measurements, indices of economic freedom country by country around the world and state by state. And what we saw between 2020 and 2022, mostly because of the COVID measures, it was the sharpest and most sudden decline in the overall index measures of economic freedom of the world that we have ever experienced since these indices started back in like the 1970s. So it is an unprecedented world event. Now, some of this was the lockdowns themselves were basically economic restrictions in addition to everything else as a restriction on our freedom. But at the same time, it also allowed for a massive accrual of government debt through deficit spending, massive expansions of the government into the economy. Remember, we even had the instance where the CDC basically told the landlords for a while that they couldn't evict non-paying tenants.
Right.
We had public outlays that were just a pork barrel festival after festival after festival of trillion-dollar budget bills and stimulus measures and PPE measures, all the loans and everything that they put out there that were never repaid back.
Right.
Massive intrusions of government into the economy. And back to the ratchet theory, back to the notion that never let a good crisis go to waste. It's like these measures that were sold to the public as we need to do this now in order to combat this unprecedented pandemic, they don't seem to be going away, or at least the people that have control over the reins of powers are very reluctant to give them up, and quite the opposite, they're trying to entrench them and make them more permanent. So permanently high levels of spending, permanently high deficits, throw on another layer on top of that. There's an Orwellian use of language or misuse of language. Inflation's been the major story of the last year because we've had 40-year highs in inflationary pressures. But what did the Biden administration and even the Federal Reserve do for about almost the first year of the signs of inflation playing out? They said, don't worry about it. It's, quote, transitory.
Yes.
So Orwellian language is all around us.
It's a fundamental Jedi mind trick on the American people. There is no inflation. Yep. Inflation is a good thing. It's only transitory. These are not the droids you're looking for. Let's talk about this. So my father has I used to have a saying that the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. And my dad said to me, Andrew, that's too complicated. There are many roads to utopia. All, however, must traverse the surface of the earth. You wrote a really interesting piece a couple of years ago about John Maynard Keynes, H.G. Wells, and the problematic utopia. Exactly. And that also plays into all of this stuff. You know, the Marxists are utopianists. You know, the Fauciites are utopianists. Talk about this piece.
Well, I think the uniting thread of all of these figures, whether it's far-left Marxists or kind of center-left progressive Keynesians or Faucists, if we want to call them that, the medical technocrats, they're all central planners. And I even wrote an essay on this, that the pandemic was an exercise in public health central planning. But go back to the Keynesians, who have always been kind of presented as the center-left alternative to socialism. It's not have the government command and control every aspect of the economy. We don't have 5-year Soviet plans to implement industrialization, but we have the government pulling levers at different spots to control swings of the business cycle. So that's the whole premise of the Keynesian model, is to give technocratic experts the ability to pull a lever. You need a fiscal stimulus now to counteract a downswing. Maybe we slow down spending here because the economy's heating up too fast. It's the basic Keynesian model. But what I did is I investigated some of the early origins of where Keynes comes at these issues and his very famous, well-known macroeconomic policy. And what tipped me off to this is I found this essay, a pretty obscure essay he had written in the early 1920s. And he basically says, I'm paraphrasing here, is that a public official's role is to attend to a balancing of the, quote, population budget just as they would a balancing of the economic budgets.
Wow.
I'm reading this, I'm scratching my head. That's a really weird statement.
That is.
And I start digging further into Keynes, and this is something that his biographers mostly dance around. They don't want to touch upon it.
Oh.
Turns out Keynes is deeply entrenched in the eugenic movement of early 20th century Great Britain. He even rises at one point, he's the vice president of the British Eugenics Society.
That's astounding.
Yeah. And not only this isn't just eugenics in the pre-World War II era when Hitlerism and Nazism really does discredit that on a scientific basis through all the horrors of the Holocaust, but there's even a moment in 1946, one of the last public speeches Keynes ever gave before he died, this is like a month before his death, is at a British Eugenics Society meeting, and he gets up to introduce the speaker, and he says that eugenics is the most important social science that we have, basically. And I'm reading this, and this is after World War II. The horrors of the Holocaust are known, and he's still saying eugenics is important. We should invest in this in the future. So I start doing some digging into Keynes's papers, and I discover this unpublished lecture that he gave in the late 1920s at something called the British Malthusian League. So you know where this is going.
You knew Malthus was going to play into this. You knew eugenics was going to play into this. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
so the British. So not only was Keynes a eugenicist, but he's a Malthusian as well.
Right, right.
Sorry, go ahead.
So he views the government's role as a purpose in controlling both the number, the level of the population, but then also the characteristics. And he says in the speech is, we finally stabilized Britain's population growth. We solved that aspect, the Malthusian problem. And then he says, now we need to turn our attention toward the population's quality, the hereditary quality. And basically what it comes down to is Keynes is an upper-class British elite, views himself as part of the intelligentsia, and he wants to remake British society to have basically be constituted of people who look and act like and come from the same economic classes and backgrounds and education levels as him. He wants a society of British intellectuals. So he writes this very famous essay, but it's done in an esoteric way in the early 1930s. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And almost every person that trains in economics, they read this essay at some point because it famously predicts that 100 years from now or whatever, that we are going to see an abundance of an age of leisure, a time when there are so many efficiencies and so much growth has been attained that maybe we can cut down to like a 15-hour work week. And people aren't going to even know what to do with themselves because they have so much leisure. And it's been presented as kind of like this optimistic utopian projection by Keynes, but if you start reading the subtext of the essay, you find that it's built upon the eugenic theory he was developing and delving into. So I go and find the original copies of the essay, dig into the archives, and I find that this essay is premised on the fact that Keynes thinks a eugenic system should have been implemented by this point 100 years in the future, and this is what's necessary to achieve this age of abundance. It's like a centrally planned population, and this all comes about through correspondence with the famous science fiction writer H.G. Wells, who does The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine, and we all read him in like ninth grade English class. He's also a British intellectual of the non-Marxian socialist left, runs in the same circles as Keynes, and I discover that Keynes and Wells are in almost constant correspondence during this period when he's writing these famous essays and preparing his macroeconomic contribution in the general theory in 1936. It's like this dialogue that's taking place between them. And Wells writes this very obscure novel called The World of William Clissold. It's one of the novels. It's like his worst novel. No one ever reads it. Because it's basically him speaking through the voice of a fictional character. William Clissold is really H.G. Wells talking. And the plot of the novel is about this intellectual that's wandering out around London and recounting the details of his lunch and dinner meetings with other fellow intellectuals. And in this fictional novel, he has a conversation where Clissold meets the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, and they talk about eugenics.
Oh, Jesus. Wow.
So I'm thinking, maybe this was actually a real conversation, and it turns out it probably was.
That's astounding.
And all their letters point to this and says, well, yeah, Keynes and Wells are actually eating dinner together, and Keynes and Wells are also collaborating on the Malthusian League and the Eugenics Society, and their letters were basically all about planning a future for the world, planning a future for Britain that has the right population to attain through scientific knowledge. All of the right planners have gotten into place. We figured out a way to manage our economic problems. We figured out a way to manage what he called the hereditary problems of the constitution of society. And those two things together are going to create this utopian world that they both envision themselves as being the intellectual progenitors of.
This is amazing. I got to tell you something. Nothing irks me more. That's not true. One of the things that irks me a great deal is when folks start invoking Malthus without the. And I'll give you an example. So we were up in New York. We have a friend whose son was in a show, and they were doing a show called Urinetown, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's actually. You would, I think, if you haven't seen it, you would appreciate it because it is essentially about the economics of water control in a society in which there's water scarcity. And there are elements of monopolistic tendencies and the corruption of government and government-controlled resources, a whole bunch of things. It's a fascinating musical, brilliantly written. until the very end when one of the characters gasps out, "Malthus was right," or it's a lyric in a song, and I'm like, and my wife sort of sees me, watches my shoulders drop, and she sort of rubs my shoulder. "It'll be okay." I was so unhappy. Listen, before I let you go, because I think it's important, and I know my listeners are sick of me hearing this, but I've got to lay it out for my guests. I think it's important for people to know that my guests are real people with sort of real outside lives, outside of the issues of economics and politics and public policy. What are some of your outside interests? What are you interested in? What jazzes you up outside of your work life?
Yeah, well, I'm a voracious consumer of historical knowledge, and that's everything from studying the past, studying obscure areas of the past that are generally outside of my main focus. So I look at U.S. economic history as my professional area of scholarship.
Sure.
But I love to read about the American Revolution. I love to read about the Civil War. I love European history in general. So studying the Middle Ages and how society developed in that era. So a voracious consumer of intellectual history, of political history.
Wow.
So those are my main areas that I work in.
You know, it's interesting. I live in Williamsburg, Virginia. I don't really say that much on the air. And obviously everything in Williamsburg is focused on the colonial era and the Revolutionary War, and I'm fascinated by those things. But I have become fascinated by the Peninsula Campaign and the Civil War. You ever get down to Williamsburg, Philip, I'll take you on the Civil War history there, because there's some fascinating things that are involved. So, Phillip Magness, thank you so very much for joining us today, good sir.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Our guest has been Phillip Magness. He is the Senior Research Faculty and Director of Research and Education at the American Institute for Economic Research. You can find them at aier.org. And I want to thank you all for joining us today on this episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream